I'm Ed. Oops. A lot of Parks up here on stage. I like to pretend I'm related to Cathy.
I think we are. We have like a ancestor from long ago.
From long ago.
Yes, a Park.
Is Park your mother's maiden
It's my
name?
mother's. Yeah.
Do you know the story of the Park name?
No.
Okay, so very briefly.
I don't know anything. I just like.
So
I know a little bit more about Hong, but I would love to know.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe I could tell you later, but the short account is that the first king of Shilla, this old Korean dynasty, was, I guess there were a bunch of tribes and villagers, and they needed a king, and they didn't know how to pick one. And then they saw a rainbow, and a horse was flying down, and they followed the horse, and there was this big egg, and from the egg hatched this baby with this beaming face, and that was the first Park, who became king.
I'm imagining you as that baby.
That's why I told the story. But
I also want to say I thank you, Ed, for having a conversation with me. We go way back.
Yeah.
We used to work at the Village Voice together. You were a copy editor, I think.
I was,
and you were when you started. And I was a fact checker.
Yeah,
it doesn't exist anymore, fact checkers, but
and the Voice doesn't exist anymore.
The Voice doesn't. Nothing exists. Anything that. There's no truth. But he was also the first editor I've ever had who edited my. It was the first article I ever wrote, and you made me rewrite it like 5 times. It made me a better wrter, though.
Well, you've written a great book. I don't know. I mean, this is an amazing crowd, and there are also people back there. How many people read any of this? It just came out yesterday, right? So some people have read some of it, but I wonder. Maybe we could talk about the title, because it's such a. Not just the title, Minor Feelings, but also the subtitle, In Asian American Reckoning. Like it's just so loaded in the best possible way. And I was, I'd written down some quotes from the book, but I thought maybe you could sort of explain the title and subtitle and sort of what your approach was in general in writing the book.
So Minor Feelings, I'll explain that first. That was... that came pretty early on. That idea came pretty early on, and it's a kind of a racialized range of emotions like shame and melancholy and suspicion and paranoia and all those beautiful feelings that you feel when you live in a kind of dominant culture that doesn't recognize your reality. And where you're constantly feeling gaslit by the dominant, usually white culture, and you don't really see this range of emotions as much in like bestseller narratives about bestseller immigrant narratives or Hollywood movies about people of color or something. It's usually centered on the individual and kind of how they're spotlit. And this, it's like with this book, I was trying to make legible all of these kind of simmering feelings I felt growing up, especially. I think I feel them a little bit less now, but when I was growing up, like there's a section in Minor Feelings where my mother, an immigrant, didn't know what Playboy was, so she didn't understand what the Playboy bunny stood for. So for whatever reason, we had a child-sized Playboy t-shirt in her house. Someone gifted it to us. I don't know who that was. So I wore it, and she sent me off to school. I went to elementary school, and then there was this kid who asked me, "Do you know what that is?" And I said, "No." And then she ran off without telling me. And of course, I just felt this incredible shame, like there was a hex on me, like the Scarlet Letter. Yeah. But it's that kind of feeling where you feel like you're a target and you're cursed and you feel this shame, but you don't know why. You don't know why it is, why you feel this. You don't have the vocabulary for it. You just don't, you're just confused about it. And you don't know if it's also just all in your head. So it's also this kind of, it's also just whatever kind of feelings you're having is also very much unacknowledged
Yeah.
too. So that's sort of minor feelings. That's what I mean. And Asian American Reckoning is. I didn't really want a subtitle for the book, but and it was really hard coming up with one. It was really important to have it be an indefinite article, and Asian American Reckoning, and it's also an Asian American Reckoning.
Oh.
You know, I'm an Asian American Reckoning. So, you know, this is one specific point of view. Somewhere in the book, I quote Jeff Chang, where he says, I want to love us, but I don't know who us is. Who is us? What is us? And so I follow that up and I ask, who is us?
Yeah.
What is us? Is there even such a thing as us? And it's this kind of meditation and constant questioning of an Asian American consciousness.
Right.
Is there one? Do I have even a right to bring it up and think about it and like give some give my own insights about it? So that's kind of the reckoning. And also it's about kind of our place or my place in this country, in this sort of capitalist white supremacist country, and our standing in it.
Yeah. I like there's a part, there's so much, even what you just said, there's so much. What I love about this book is there's so much in every essay, every chapter, and it's so deep and so much of it hits home. But it's also very funny, as you know, what you just read. It's both very, it's like a portrait of depression, but it's also pretty funny. But there's a part where you're kind of, to your point, you're kind of wondering what is there an us? Is there a we? What is Asian American? Are all Asian American? Then you ask, are all Asian Americans self-hating? And then a Filipino friend is like, no, just Koreans. Filipinos are okay. but I think the more serious point though is that there is that kind of blanket assumption that all Asian Americans have have the same emotions or lack of emotion, and they come from the same place, and it, nothing could be further from the truth. So that was one of the first hooks into me, where I was like, she knows, this book is going to take me somewhere that, I haven't really been before.
Yeah.
So, Oh, well, talking about minor feelings, do you have to be Asian to have minor feelings?
No, I don't think so. I think like anyone can have minor feelings, but, I think really it's a racialized range of emotions. And so anyone who's in a marginalized community, I mean, it was actually first inspired by watching Richard Pryor, and how he was expressing his minor feelings of shame and melancholy and rage through, or repressed rage through his stand-up comedy. So it's, minor feelings is something that can be felt, I think, in African American, Latinx, or just, I would say, like any marginal communities. It's not, and there are also Asians who probably don't feel any minor feelings. They can read this book and be like, I have a great life. I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't read this book.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can talk about, I mean, there's so much to talk about, but there are two figures in this. I mean, there are a lot of figures and examples in this book, but two of the major ones are Richard Pryor and the Korean American artist / poet / uncategorizable Teresa Hak-young Cha. I want to get to her, but maybe you could expand a little bit. There's a essay here called Stand Up, and you really go deep into Richard Pryor, who I'm a child of the 70s, so I remember always wanting to see those specials and like listening to his records at the Next Door Neighbor's house. But I didn't really revisit it until reading this essay, and it's incredible stuff, obviously. But can you talk about a little more about your connection to his material?
Sure.
And,
sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, I would say that watching Richard Pryor was perhaps, I've been saying this in interviews, is one of the seeds that led to writing of this book, which I also write about in the book. The book is also just me writing about the book.
There's a part where you're like, when I was reading from this book earlier, I was like, She's still writing it now.
It's very meta.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I love that.
But I was, I talk about my depression, and then in the second essay, I continue talking about being depressed. Then while I was depressed, we watched live in concert, Richard Pryor's live in concert, and I've seen clips of his comedy before, and I've seen his movies. And in fact, the first movie I saw was when I was a kid. I saw Toy, which is a horrible movie. It's about a movie where he plays a rich white boy's toy, and it's horrible. And that was not in I put that in and I took it out. But anyway, but I've never really seen his stand-up comedy in full, and so I saw that his live in concert, and I just had this sort of light bulb moment, and I was just blown away. I say it in the book. He blowtorched the beige from my eyes, and I was just really mesmerized by how raw and truthful he was about race than anything that I was reading at the time. And this was way back in 2011 or so. And I was just really jaded about the poetry world, and I just thought there was just a lot of microaggressions, and there was a lot of veiled racism
in the poetry world.
In the poetry, in the literary world, that was just not acknowledged. I think we're in a very different place right now in literature, but back then, you really had to play the game of respectability politics in order to gain any kind of success, and I was just really bummed out about that. And then I saw Richard Pryor, and I was just amazed by his gutsiness, his daring, and just the incredible complexity of his stand-up comedy, because not only were they like hilarious, but also just really dark. And he was able to kind of use comedy as a vehicle to tell these really ugly truths about this country. And I was like, I wanted to learn from him.
Right.
So I say this in the book, I transcribed all of his audio material and all his visual material. And I was like, I'm going to do something with this. I thought I would. I don't know why. I just did it. I don't know why. I just couldn't.
You felt such strong attraction to the work that you're just trying to not emulate it, but you're copying stuff down.
I'm just copying stuff, and I was looking at other stand-up comedians and so forth, and just the way they were able to get at the truth. So that was my experience, and then that eventually led to the writing of this book.
Right. You have a line saying. Comedians can't pretend they don't have identities. There's nowhere to hide because you're on stage. They see what you look like, and I think that means what race you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned that you yourself did some stand-up comedy during this time.
So yeah, it's all in stand-up. I was I did. So I was saying this in the book, that I was in a very masochistic state of mind, and so I wanted to just really push myself towards really extreme discomfort. I hated doing readings. I hated doing poetry readings, especially during that time. I just, as you can tell from what I read, and so I was like, and I just hated the sort of church-like etiquette of reading. And again, I think readings have changed a lot. It's a lot more
and this was even
heterogeneous.
Was this after your second book?
It was after Dance Revolution, and also even after. I hated reading from Dance Revolution. No, I didn't. That's a very difficult book to read because it's like this invented pigeon. But I like to make life difficult for myself. Yeah. And then Engine Empire also. It was even during the writing of Engine Empire and a little bit afterwards. So I was like, I guess I just wanted to like shake things up for myself and also for other people. So whenever I was asked to do I only did this a few times, but like whenever I was asked to do a poetry reading, and I would get up and instead of reading my poems, I would do a stand-up routine. And it's
amazing.
It was not always successful.
Any of the bits?
Huh?
Do you remember any of the bits? I mean, I'm not asking.
But I'm not going to repeat it.
But were they kind of under the spell of Pryor? Like, are you?
Yeah, they were very offensive jokes. I mean, they were like sexual, but autobiographical too, and just not. And I did like a formal presentation of it in the New Museum back in 2013, and that was great because my friends were there, and they were like laughing uproariously, and I was like, I could just do this for a living. And then I just would kind of surprise the people in the audience by doing it, and they were just like confused. It's like, what are you doing? But they were pretty.
They were having some.
They were pretty
dirty
jokes.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. You can tell me those later.
Yeah.
Speaking of doing it as an art exhibit, there's a great. I don't know if it's the longest piece in the book, but in education, it's kind of this. How would I describe it? I feel like the term female friendship gets overused, but it's definitely that. It's also a kind of the making of you as an artist, poet, / poet. Could you talk about that a little bit? I found it absolutely fascinating, and
it was actually, it's probably the most personal essay in the book. I know that first introduction was also pretty personal, but I also get it's also kind of analytical in different parts of the book. Education is about my friendship with two women that I went to college with. I went to Oberlin, and they're both Asian American. And at the time I was thinking, I was just like really craving a story about female friendships that prioritized art making and writing. Friendships that sort of passed the Bechdel test, but really was about art making in the way that, like, there's so many art movements that mythologize male friendships, like de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, and the list can go on. And I was just reading about these friendships. I wish there was one about women, and especially women of color, women of color. I mean, like, there's nothing on women of color, and then I was thinking, well, I had that experience. I had that experience in college, and I think it started, and then it started even before that. Like, one of the women I was friends with was not very mentally stable, and it was very difficult being friends with her and being maybe at times traumatic. And I wanted it to be this kind of tidy story of feminist camaraderie, but it was also the story was about art making, but it was also very messy too. Right. There is intergenerational trauma and all of that, but that's more in the subtext that kind of drove our fucked up friendships. Right. Yeah.
There's a point where you're all. I feel like you start as a visual artist, as your friends, and then I don't know if maybe a couple of you are taking the same poetry class. You start making poems, but you kind of don't want one of them, who you call Helen here, to follow you in a way, because she's so dominant in your life that you wanted one thing almost for yourself. And it just felt very honest about. I mean, you're all very close, and yet there are these conflicts.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's like female friendships. There's so many stories about female friendships now, but and just from reading any of the stories about female friendships that it's not warm and cozy, and it's not like there's a lot of competition and jealousy and cattiness and bitchiness and all of that. And and it was the same thing with my friends. There was jealousy, but this friend Helen was a very dominant personality in my life. And in the book, I say I felt like Steve Buscemi and The Big Lebowski. It was like just the kind of watery-eyed sidekick of the three. And although they might disagree with that. And I'm sorry, what was
I don't know. I mean, I just thought
Oh yeah. And I just like, I guess
Yeah.
it was like, and it's just when you're so close and you're making art together, you're just always going to copy each other and steal from each other and so forth and so forth. And I just felt really protective. Like I wanted my poetry to be my thing, because I was also jealous of them because they were, they were the art stars, and I just wasn't in the book. I just never felt like I was as good as them and so forth. And so I was like, well, I could be good at poetry. I could do this. I'll do this. I'll write poetry.
Well, there's this great line where and this is another kind of meta, self-reflexive. I don't want to give the impression that the book is like this meta labyrinth. Like the way you do it is really good. But in writing this essay, it's as if I'm summoning her, Helen, back into my life, summoning her to be enraged with me, as if like something about her is sort of meeting you at the level of intensity that you want for these essays. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, she's I mean, I think it was very difficult. All the essays were very difficult, but I think a lot of the difficulty of writing this essay, friendship, is I'm no longer friends with Helen, and it was just, this is what happens when you write memoir, which I've never dealt with before because my poems weren't autobiographical, which is that I'm writing about this person who's still here in this world. And I just felt like trespassing to write honestly about her life. And so it was like, but it was by writing about it, I almost wanted her to, our friendship was severed many years ago, but it was like almost like I was summoning her, like I want her back in my life to be angry with me, which might happen. I don't know.
I know, well,
yeah.
Hopefully she's not here tonight. But
I know, I'm like,
just this is to backtrack a little. I've been following your poetry ever since your first book, which when I saw the title, Translating Mom, I was like, oh, I know what that word is. Maybe I know the answer, but why you have 3 books of very acclaimed poetry, very amazing kind of like mind-bending poetry. What led you to try this form, and then did you find it easier than expected, harder than expected? How did it feel?
Yeah, no, I mean, this book is like radically different from my poetry. My poetry uses a lot of different dictions. It's very experimental. Everything, I like to write about invented worlds, invented characters, and this book is not that. And it's also kind of, for me, written in a fairly straightforward language. It's very transparent in the way that my poetry was not transparent. So that was actually quite scary, and that was not at all easy. It was like I had nowhere to hide. Right. I couldn't hide behind persona. I couldn't hide behind
it's
invented
kind of like
worlds.
Richard Pryor or
comics.
I
had to like stand there behind. I had to stand in front of a brick wall with only a microphone. Like it was like I was in front of it. I was before a firing squad. And it was just very exposing, and that's why I was also really scared of the publication of this book, because I was never published something so autobiographical like this. I mean, I wrote this book on a dare. It was almost like a dare to myself. I was like thinking, why haven't I ever written anything autobiographical? Why haven't I? I mean, race has always been on my mind. I've always it's everywhere in my poetry, but I've never really directly wrote a book about Asian American identity. That's something that I kind of was. I was like, that's I always thought it was so cliche, but it was almost like it was a dare to myself to do. I'm like, what can I do with a subject that is so cliche and warmed over, and how can I make this fresh and relevant and urgent? And that was the kind of dare. And of course there are other reasons why, like watching Richard Pryor and seeing him and thinking, oh wait, like I guess I just didn't have a way. Like I didn't know how to do it. And then like when I was watching Pryor, I was like, okay, wait, maybe there is a way to do it. It was Richard Pryor. I think I also became a mom. Being a mother really changed my life, changed my writing in a way where, I never, I didn't think of myself as a sort of misfit outlier character. I was like, I'm a role model now. I'm a role model I have to be a role model to my daughter, and I'm like bringing her into this world. And I was also kind of scared, bringing a young girl and an Asian girl, and I was like, it was very hard for me when I was growing up. So it just brought up all these memories, and I was like, and that was also a reckoning. I was like, I have to reckon with my early memories and my own childhood and make it better for my daughter.
Totally. Here, I feel like I'm going to cry. But there are some piercing moments in the book where just somebody said, especially like when you're a kid, there's a part where you're with your sister and somebody just says some jerk says, chink, and it's like, I also like, obviously that has happened to me, but I feel like I live my life without thinking about that, but just that one, just having somebody say that it happened, like, oh my God, then it's like you kind of see everything through that lens.
I know.
Anyway,
it's weird. It's like people, hear this a lot, and it's like racism doesn't happen to Asians, or Asians don't experience racism, and you just sort of accept that.
Yeah. Well, I was listening to this Times podcast, and it the hosts, who were people of color, were like, we heard that these people these Asian Americans were made fun of at this theater, like going into a movie, like we're like, we didn't know that happened. And I was like, how do you, like, how is it that our our I don't know, these slights are so under the radar? And I don't know. I think that's probably like the unspoken reason that I think this book really hit me hard. That you're saying these things that really nobody's said. Yeah.
And I don't know why. I mean, people say it, but I really wanted to kind of unpack it. Not just write about these scenes of racism that I encountered as a child, but also really unpack it and how it's related to the world, everything else, So
I don't want to run out of time, but I wanted to ask you about this idea of, we're talking about your poetry a little, and this idea of bad English. And I felt like what was great as a fan of your poetry, like reading you talk about this idea of bad English, like I came to your poetry with like a kind of a new angle, but maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
The essay?
Just how would you define it, and what does it mean, and why do you embrace it, I guess?
I think I say in the book, bad English is my heritage. And that essay starts out with me talking about growing up speaking bad English, and growing up speaking broken English, and hearing broken English around me. And then I had a very fraught relationship with language when I became a poet, because I felt like I had to write in this, in this way, in this very standard poetic way that didn't feel natural to me. And it's like that essay is about sort of this evolution of how I kind of embraced that bad English. And, and I quote, I was just teaching this in class, quote Nate Mackey, that, as poets or writers, we have to other English, other as a verb, or turning, or we turn, what do I say? Like what did I say?
Something good.
Huh?
Something good.
We have to other English, we have to queer it, twerk it, Calibanize it, and so forth. Right. And it's like, and only in that way. And you don't see that as much, I think, because of the internet. But a lot of my poetry is kind of this mix of different dictions and Korean and so forth that's based on sort of early childhood. Yeah.
Do we have a moment to talk about, I just wanted to touch on Teresa Hakyoung Cha. Can we talk about that? Because I think what you wrote, do people here know who she is? Yes, right? Okay. But, maybe you could explain a little bit, just put her in context a little. I strongly feel like this is the best thing I've ever read about about her, and it really answered a lot of questions. I don't want to spoil it for the people who are going to read it, but could you talk a little bit about who she was and what you did in this piece that
Sure.
I think is unique? Yeah.
That was probably, the whole book was hard to write, but I think that last essay was perhaps her hardest. Teresa Hak-Kyung Cha is an artist, poet. She published this book, Dictée, that came out right after she was raped and murdered in New York City in the Puck Building, which is on Lafayette. And I was introduced to Dictée by my teacher, Myung-Mi Kim, in college, which I also write about, who's amazing, who's a brilliant poet. And Dictée was a book that was foundational to my poetry. I mean, like, that's how I kind of honed my bad English skills, was by reading a lot of Teresa Hak-Kyung Cha's, rereading Teresa Hak-Kyung Cha's Dictée, which is sort of this bricolage of photos and essay and poetry about her mother and Korea and French film. It's like just so many different subjects. But anyway, there's been a lot of, she's taught in a lot of Asian American courses and experimental classes, experimental poetry classes and so forth. And she's shown her art, her video art is shown worldwide. And there's a lot of bibliography about her work, a lot of scholarship, but no one wrote about her rape and murder. Like, no one. And I didn't really check into it either. I just assumed that someone else wrote about it. But I never bothered to find out what happened. And so I was writing this review where I mentioned Teresa Hak-Kyung Cha, and I was like just checking the date of her death. And then I just was searching, and I was like, there was nothing about her death. And what was even stranger was that in a lot of the essays I read, people wouldn't even use the word rape. They would just say she died in, or she was murdered in New York City, and that was it, right. Because it was. And so a lot of the essays, first of all, like a what happened, I go into what happened. The court documents are all there. His murder, the murderer was convicted and in jail, Joseph Sansa. But it's also about the silence surrounding her death. Why this silence? Also when she died, no one wrote about her death. There was nothing. You could say it's the 80s. There was a lot of crazy shit happening in the 80s, but, rape, homicides didn't occur. And also, like, a few years later, the Central Park jogger situation happened, which was all, of course, we still hear about it today for many, many reasons. But there was silence then, and then there was silence even when she was rediscovered. And so this kind of silence went from neglect to this kind of silence that was both this sort of diffident respect and fear of kind of finding out what really happened. So it's like a lot of that essay is about kind of unpacking that, and also my own relationship with this. And it was just, and I talked to her family, I talked to her brother, and she still has living relatives. And that was also part of the reason why I didn't, I felt both the permission to write about it, but also why other people didn't write about it. They're like, we don't want to upset the family.
The family.
We don't want to disturb the family. We don't want to, which is kind of an Asian thing to say.
No, totally. And there's even the race plays a big part in it. And I think you mentioned that. One of her friends says, if this were a white woman on the Upper East Side, like the papers would be all over it. But it was an Asian woman, so they didn't. And then did somebody else say, like, try to at some academic conference, like, that her death was like a form of Asian passivity or something like that.
Performance art.
Like some like really noxious formulation. It's just also, it's like a great piece of reporting. I was completely fascinated by this essay, and I just felt like we should talk about it at least a little bit.
I got to resurrect the journalist in me
there
again.
You go.
I wasn't miss doing that, so that was really great. Yeah.
I wonder if now is the time for
Q&A.
questions?
Yeah.
Okay, from the audience.
I have a microphone too, so I can bring it around to anyone who has a question.
Hi. I have yet to read the book, but from hearing you speak, you talk a lot about obviously feeling seen from the facial tic and then perhaps getting up on stage and doing stand-up comedy. How did the concepts of visibility and invisibility shape or inform your writing?
I mean, it's the core of the book, I mean, like minor feelings, another way of thinking about minor feelings is sort of the roiling emotions that you feel when you're invisible in this country, when you're not acknowledged. And, I think like when you're a person of color, there's like the spectrum that goes from invisibility to hypervisibility. So if you're like a trans person or a black man, a young black man, then you're hyper visible. For, say, if you're Muslim, you're more hyper visible, and it changes, I guess, depending on where the historical moment that we're in. Me being this East Asian woman, I've always grown up being hyper invisible. And in the end, and so a lot of that about being seen and then also at the same time being able to see more than, say, someone white and privileged who's been flogged by privilege, who's not able to see as much. But in the book, I talk about like sometimes being Asian feels like being ghosted by this country, where you're just, you don't, I mean, we're not even, like if you look at voting polls or statistics on workplace discrimination or sexual harassment or rape or whatever, Asians are never mentioned. They're always other. We're always in the other box. Like just the other day I was checking, there was like a racial breakdown on who's voting for Bernie, Warren, Biden, and they're African Americans, Latinx, other. Did
you see any of the debate yesterday?
No, I
So when they would mention, like, we want to get black voters, white voters, sometimes they'd say Latino. I was like watching, I was like, say Asian. And my kids were like, they didn't say Asian.
No. We're just,
come on.
Never know. We're always just other, And so it is a huge part. And also being a woman as well, And I mean, that also drives Teresa Huck, the essay about Teresa Huck Yang Cha, about how her rape and murder is not seen, not acknowledged,
Okay, so everyone can hear me. I was just wondering about, you were mentioning the timing of writing this, becoming a mother and other things that you've sort of thought about in your life, and I was just wondering about if you could imagine writing this at a different time in your life, whether you're younger or if you'll go back to it when you're...
I couldn't have written it when I was younger. I don't think I had the clarity or the wisdom to write it. I was so confused when I was young, and I had so many defenses, and I just... Maybe if I started seeing a therapist when I was younger, I could have written it. But no, I think I could have only written it with having a child. There was something about having a child that give me this kind of distance and this perspective that was able on my life, So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Uh-huh.
You talk a lot about how one characteristic of racism is that children are treated like adults and adults are treated like children. I wonder if you could talk about that.
So I write about childhood a lot in the book, especially in this essay called End of White Innocence. And, I talk about how innocence is very much constructed by sort of this Western European culture. And if say someone like Wes Anderson, who I write about in the essay, looks back at childhood, I often felt like I was looking sideways at childhood, because the innocence of childhood was something that was not available to me, because what was prevalent throughout my childhood was this feeling of shame, which is kind of the opposite of innocence. Innocence is where it's free to be you and me, it's just you feel uninhibited and confident, and you don't think about your skin color or anything. Whereas when you feel shame, you are both, you see yourself in the first and third person, you know? And so I write about that in the essay, and I write about how also when you are racialized in any way as a child, there's this weird inversion happens where I'm treated like an adult. So you were talking about like that incident, like when I was, you know, in a mall with my sister. We were young and we were leaving the mall, and this grown man was entering the store. He was like, "I don't open doors for chinks," you know, and he was not seeing. My sister was very young. I mean, he wasn't seeing us as children, you know, and at the same time, you know, Asian adults are treated like children. And there's also a lot of pain in that. That was almost more humiliating for me as a kid, because I would see my mother and my father condescended to and mocked constantly by adults, white adults. And it's like they don't see that I see that. And that was just very humiliating. And so they're condescended like children, whereas we're dismissed as if we're not children who need to be, you know, cared for. Mm-hmm.
So I found it really interesting that Richard Pryor was, you know, one of the starting points for this book, and it sort of reminded me of how, you know, other Asian American artists like Margaret Cho, I think she was, that was very formative, or Richard Pryor was formative for her as well. And it got me thinking about how so much of Asian American identity, the models that we seek out, a lot of times happen to be African American, that's what's available to us. And then tying that into your subtitle about an Asian American reckoning, and how we're living in this kind of glorious moment of a reckoning, a cultural reckoning for gender and race. But I feel like the race tends to be very focused on specific groups, and sometimes that reckoning is not on, you know, we're still invisible in this kind of reckoning that we're having on discussions about race. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And
the relationship between races, you mean? Or?
No, I just think it's really interesting because we have this kind of amazing moment now in the past few years, because, you know, you mentioned a few times how, I was writing this back then, but now things are different. And, you know, I just feel like the moment we're having now is amazing in terms of greater diversity. You know, just look at the books here, for example, and the readers coming and speaking here. It's amazing. But, you know, I feel like we're still excluded from a lot of these, you know, kind of as Asian Americans, this reckoning that we're having, this cultural reckoning.
Yeah. I don't know what to make of this moment yet. I think we're in it, and we'll see if it will evolve into a sustained reckoning, and whether this woke culture can last. You know, earlier in my book, I talk about how when I was in college, actually, people were reading, it wasn't, you know, people were reading, I was reading poets of color and fiction writers of color. All my friends were people of color. I mean, there was like, you know, in the art world, it was very diverse, and a lot of this discussion was already was happening back then. And then it got shut down. And now it's coming back because of Trump and other, you know, Black Lives Matter and so forth. And it's very exciting to see whether whether that energy will be sustained is up to our white capitalist culture, and it's also up to us, you know, to really push it forward. And you know, African Americans have had a very long tradition of oppositional literature that, and I think a lot of Asian, like myself, Asian Americans who have write about race are indebted to them, you know, absolutely indebted to them. And I think, like, you know, Baldwin, anyone, you know, Toni Morrison, they are the canon. They're the American canon. I I think there have been Asian American literature in the past, in the 70s, but they're just not, people aren't like Teresa Hak-Young Cha, but then, or in the 80s, or like Janice Murray-Katani, or, there's so many writers in the past who have had that, but then they just disappear because we don't continue to uphold their voices, and we're just obsessed with the next hot thing or the next new thing. And I think it's also, for us, it's not only important to embrace new voices, but it's also important for us to kind of lift up voices from the past, because there are also Asian American voices from the past that have been, that have paved the way that we don't acknowledge. It's absolutely essential. And I also think it's like, there's so much there. We have far to go. There's so much, there's so many controversies. I think, Claudia Rankine was saying that we only think of race in the vocabulary of a spectacle, and we don't. It's like, I don't think we've really kind of found sustained discourse and vocabulary to talk about how to write about race, how to write about each other. And one thing, I write about Richard Pryor, who I'm indebted to, but then I also write about the difficulties of Black-Asian relations. And that is something that we also don't touch. We don't talk about the interracial conflicts, and it's always in relation to whiteness. And I just think we have, and I really hope we get there. I hope it's not going to be a trend that will be just shut down after a while. And that has happened, and I just want to make sure that doesn't happen again.
We have time for one more question. This will be our last one.
Who do you most wish would read this book?
Oh, God. Oh, my God, what a question. I don't know. Certainly not my parents. Barack Obama. No.
He's probably reading it right now.
Oh, yeah. I want to be on that list. No, I don't know. I think maybe my daughter, when she's older, I would want her to read it. I want everyone to read it. Yeah. Yeah.
We want that too. And on that note, we have copies of Minor Feelings. Oh, yeah, let's have a big round of applause.